Well, good afternoon. I'm Scott Sagan, professor of political science and co-director here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. And it's with great pleasure that I want to welcome Rebecca Davis Gibbons to Center today. I note that the bio that we downloaded is out of date because it says you're an assistant professor, but she recently received tenure, so we should congratulate her first on that. She's at the University of Southern Maine. She has served as a fellow associate of the project of managing the atom at our sister center, the Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Before becoming an academic, Dr. Gibbons taught elementary school in the Marshall Islands, and then also served as National Security Policy Analyst at SAIC, providing research and analytic support for arms control and non-proliferation issues to Headquarters Air Force prior to getting her PhD. She'll be talking today on a fantastic book that was published this past year, The Hegemon's Toolkit, published by Cornell University Press. We'll have her speak for approximately half an hour and then have a discussion around the table and including people from online. People who are online, please put your questions into the Q&A. Thank you. Rebecca, welcome.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to CSAC for having me. Thank you to Scott. Thank you to Katie. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk about my book here today. It is a recent book, but this book is actually older than my 10-and-a-half-year-old daughter, so it feels funny to say recent. I've been working on it off and on for over 10 years, and I'm really glad to be able to share it with you. So we're going to begin by going back to the beginning of the nuclear age. As you know, in the summer of 1945, the United States exploded the first nuclear weapon in the desert of New Mexico, and soon after, it would drop atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, archival documents indicate that the United States, or US leaders, thought that their monopoly on this new and destructive weapon could last as long as 2 decades. So 20 years, they might have a monopoly on nuclear weapons. But in August 1949, just 4 years later, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear weapon. The United Kingdom would follow in 1952, and then France in 1960. So in 1963, after living through the Cuban Missile Crisis the previous fall, President Kennedy explained at a press conference that he was, quote, haunted by the feeling that by 1970, unless we are successful, there may be 10 nuclear powers instead of 4, and by 1975, 15 or 20. Now, this is probably the most overused quotation in all of nuclear studies. You've all heard it before, but just stick with me for a moment. It's not just Kennedy who said this, right? Members of the intelligence community and academics predicted that many more states would develop nuclear weapons. In particular, there was the assumption that any state that had the resources and the technical capabilities would build this weapon. And yet today we have 9 nuclear weapon states, the same number that we had 30 years ago, trading North Korea and South Africa. Now, this quotation that I mentioned from the 1963 press conference with JFK here is often used to illustrate his concern with proliferation, but I want to point out the part where he said, unless we are successful. Unless we are successful, there may be 10 nuclear powers instead of 4, and by 1975, 15 or 20. And so I argue, along with many others, that the international community actually has been quite successful in its efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. Now, of course, it hasn't been, the record is not perfect, but I think it's been highly effective. And many scholars and practitioners credit the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, with contributing to this outcome. So if you're in this room, you know the NPT is a treaty that was negotiated largely by the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1960s. It allows 5 states to possess nuclear weapons. These are the 5 that had tested by January 1st of 1967. So that's the US, the Soviet Union, the UK, France, and China. And then all other states in the international system, if they decided to join, would have to join as non-nuclear weapon states. And in exchange, they have access to peaceful nuclear technology. All non-nuclear states would have to sign on to safeguards agreements, allowing international atomic energy inspectors to come in and inspect their nuclear facilities and check on their nuclear material. And then all members non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states alike agreed to pursue good faith measures towards eventual disarmament. We'll come back to that later. That's that Article 6 commitment. So this treaty, the NPT, has lasted close to 53 years. It boasts the membership of all but 5 states in the international system today. But I argue in this book, the NPT was just the beginning. As new dangers emerged or weaknesses in the treaty became apparent, the international community worked together to forge new pacts that would bolster the NPT's goals. And so together, all of these agreements and activities make up the nuclear non-proliferation regime, which I define as the set of activities and the set of institutions and activities aimed at curtailing the spread of nuclear weapons and dangerous nuclear material. I would argue that this regime has endured through global changes in power, global changes in power dynamics. It has overcome challenges from states that have violated their commitment to this treaty. And so in my book, The Hegemon's Toolkit, I asked, why do states adhere to the nuclear non-proliferation regime? And when I use the word adhere, I'm looking at both the actual decision to ratify a treaty or support another activity within the regime. And then why do some states take much longer to do so than others? The short answer here is for decades, the US government has undertaken significant diplomatic effort to make the NPT and then other aspects of this regime nearly universal. And of course, the US had strategic interest in doing this, right? It wanted to prevent the emergence of other nuclear armed states. These small powers could limit the US's freedom of action around the world. It could get the US involved in a nuclear war, and it could lead to changing global power dynamics. And so, like the NPT, many other international institutions, the US, with the NPT, many other institutions the US created, it wanted universal membership, right? The US didn't care if a country didn't have any nuclear material, if it had no interest in having nuclear reactors, the US still pushed for universal ratification of these agreements. And so I argue in the book that the NPT and the broader regime should be considered part of the post-World War II global ordering project that the US undertook. Now, you might be thinking now, what about the Soviet Union? This was a bipolar system when this began, and that is true. Based on my research, I argue that the Soviet Union largely cooperated with the US, but it was the United States that played a singular role in promoting the regime. And I think more recent research, both in political science and by historians, has shown this to be true. The US also led the international community in establishing and promoting adaptations to the regime when weaknesses became apparent. So if I'm arguing to you that the US is the chief promoter of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, then understanding variation in adherence needs understanding how different states respond to US tools of persuasion. So as the most powerful state in the international system through much of the nuclear age, the US has had many tools with which to persuade other states to join or otherwise support these nuclear non-proliferation agreements. In general, when there is a new agreement or activity, the US government requests that all states join or cooperate. It does this with a simple diplomatic request, and this is what I call low-cost diplomacy. And so these are routine actions that are taken by the State Department or previously by the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, the now defunct agency in the US government. And then if that initial request doesn't work, the US will move on to high-cost diplomacy, possibly inducements, and in rare cases, at least in this field, there are limited examples of coercion. So those are the categories. I don't expect you to be able to read all of these. I know it's quite small. This is a table that's in the book, but I wanted to give you some sense of examples of each of these. So low-cost diplomacy, as we said, sending cables, sending demarches. These are from lower level State Department officials. Something the US also does is try to go to multilateral meetings and add pertinent language about the commitment to a particular agreement or institution in that. High-cost diplomacy is when you have those appeals, but they come from the president, the vice president, maybe the secretary of state, and those can happen again by cable, by letter, and in-person meetings. Then we move on to positive inducements. That's when the US offers The target state may be military aid or economic aid, offers membership in an institution, or they might also offer to assist in a particular global issue that's of interest to that country. Now, rarely in the archival documents are you going to find this very clear quid pro quo, right? No one in the US government is going to say, we're going to give you this aid if you sign on to this treaty, right? At least that's not documented. But in talking to State Department officials, they say things like, well, there are ways that you have these conversations, right? So you might be in a conversation talking about the potential provision of economic aid or military aid. And then part of that conversation is also, it's really important to the president, or it's really important to the US government that you sign on to this treaty. And so that's what I'm talking about here. And then in very limited cases, we do have coercion. So that could be making implicit threats to reduce economic or military aid. Again, not very explicit, but kind of in that conversation where it's in the mind of the target state's leaders to think, maybe I want to be careful here about changing my mind or not joining this treaty. There's one case which I am going to talk about where I think that the implicit threat of force actually brought a country into the NPT, but again, that is quite rare. And so then what determines if these tools work or not for particular states? And so my argument is that the answer to that lies in each target state's level of embeddedness within the overall US-led global ordering project. And so I define embeddedness as the extent to which a state's policy preferences and political values align with those of the United States. And so for the sake of simplicity, you can see here that I categorize states into these 4 categories: highly embedded, moderately embedded, weakly embedded, and antagonistic. So the more embedded the state, the less costly it is for the US to persuade them to join the agreement. Antagonistic states may not join at all. And so I test this theory of embeddedness using case studies of state decision-making about joining the NPT, supporting indefinite extension of the NPT in 1995, and concluding a safeguards agreement known as the Model Additional Protocol, which was established in 1997. And I look at cases including Japan, Egypt, Indonesia, Cuba, and South Africa. So based on what I've told you so far, these are the observable implications of the theory. So the US and its allies will promote the universalization of the regime using their tools of influence. Decisions by target states to adhere to or support regime agreements will reflect consideration of US preferences and tools. And then decisions to adhere to or support regime elements will reflect embeddedness with the US-led order. And as I stated before, I expect highly embedded states to require less persuasive or lower cost tools, and then antagonistic states will rarely adhere. So then next, I'm going to give you 3 illustrations from the book from different chapters to give you a sense of some of the empirical evidence. So first, let's move to Cuba. The NPT chapter, it's the first empirical chapter in the book. It explores the decisions of Japan, Indonesia, Egypt, and Cuba to join the NPT. So I'm going to talk about the Cuban case because I think it is fascinating, and I hadn't read about this prior to doing this research. I thought it might be interesting to you. And so, as you can imagine, I code Cuba as an antagonistic state within the US-led global order since its communist revolution in the 50s. And consistent with expectations for an antagonistic state, Cuba long refused to join any elements of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Cuba is actually one of the 4 states that actually voted against the NPT in the General Assembly at the UN. Nonetheless, Cuban leaders, mainly Castro, but others, again and again would state their support for the NPT in theory and in practice, so they behave consistently with it. They think it is a good idea, but they pointed out every time their poor relationship with the United States to explain why they couldn't join. So in other words, Cuban leaders saw the NPT through the lens of their relationship with the United States. And that's a point I make in this book, that states have come to identify the NPT in the regime with US leadership. The Soviet Union was Cuba's patron ally during the Cold War, seems to be at times unwilling or unable to persuade Cuba to join the NPT and conclude a safeguards agreement. Cuba does eventually join the NPT, and at the same time also concludes a comprehensive safeguards agreement, an additional protocol, and ratifies the Treaty of Tlatelolco, the Latin American nuclear weapons free zone, all in the lead up to the 2003 Iraq War. So why is this? So this is what I'm positing. This is my argument. We don't have smoking gun evidence of this, but I think this is what happened. So in May of 2002, Undersecretary of State John Bolton gives a speech in which he accused Cuba of maintaining a biological weapons program. And he said they may even supply these to other rogue states, right? This is the period when we're worried about rogue states. And so 4 months after Bolton's speech, in what came as a surprise, we see Cuba announcing that it's going to join Treaty of Tlatelolco, adhere to the NPT, and conclude this comprehensive safeguards agreement and the additional protocol. And I think the additional protocol is especially surprising, as it is the most stringent nuclear safeguards agreement possible. At the time, IAEA officials communicated to Cuban leaders that they could add a protocol to their safeguards agreement because they had so little nuclear material. So countries with safeguards agreements with the IAEA that don't have much nuclear material can attach something called an SQP, or small quantities protocol. So that was offered to the Cuban leadership, and they said no, right? So they could have limited the inspections in their country, but they wanted to have the inspections associated with the additional protocol. And according to one IAEA official, the person said Cuba was seeking transparency. So Cuba wanted, even though it was in the nuclear realm, wanted to say, we are open to inspectors, and wanted to, I think, try to say, we don't have biological weapons in this country, and we don't need to have military action against us. Consistent with this idea that Cuba felt militarily threatened by the US at this time, we see that Havana began directing civil defense readiness procedures in early 2003. So I think this is a rare case of a state actually joining non-proliferation agreements because they felt a potential military threat. All right, so that's one case with the NPT. I'm going to move on to the indefinite extension of the NPT. As many of you probably know, when the NPT is drafted, many non-nuclear weapon states were not willing to forego the option to have nuclear weapons for all time. So Article 10, Section 2 of the treaty says that 25 years after entry into force, the membership would convene and determine the future of the treaty. Would it continue indefinitely, or would it be extended again for a fixed period of time? And so because the NPT entered into force in 1970, the 1995 review conference for the NPT became the Review and Extension Conference. And so starting, as you might imagine, quite early in the early 1990s, the US starts organizing within ACTA and the State Department to promote the idea of unconditional indefinite extension. Unconditional in the sense that the US didn't want to be held to any particular action in order for other states to go along with indefinite extension. And so we see the US stood up an office with multiple people. As far as I can tell, it's the only country in the world that stood up an office that had multiple people, multiple diplomats devoted to getting this outcome of indefinite extension. The NATO allies joined first. We had other European states, as well as the G7, signed on to this in the early 90s. One of the most significant challenges for the US in achieving indefinite extension was ensuring that the non-aligned movement did not show up at this conference in the spring of 1995 with a unified position. At the time of this conference, there was 111 members of the non-aligned movement. So if they had been able to come and say, we're not doing this unconditional extension in perpetuity, we want a 25-year extension, we want to vote every 10 years, anything that they had a unified proposal in, they had the numbers. And so part of the US strategy was to divide the NOM and make sure they didn't arrive in New York with an alternative proposal. So I argue in the book that a key to the US splitting the NOM was focusing on South Africa. Now I code in the book, South Africa is a moderately embedded state at this time, and it really was a key player in achieving indefinite extension. And so in the run up to this conference, South African leaders had to decide if they would follow the non-aligned movement, and they were new members of the non-aligned movement, or go along with the United States, who is putting a great amount of pressure on them. And so just to give you some examples, there's more in the book, but we saw high cost diplomacy. So both Vice President Gore and President Clinton personally and in meetings asked Mbeki and Mandela to support indefinite extension. President Clinton made it clear that this was a high priority for his administration. This is also a time when the US is promising hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to help with South Africa's transition to democracy. In November of 1994, President Clinton announced the establishment of this joint commission to promote cooperation between the two nations, and that commission would be led by Deputy President Mbeki and Vice President Al Gore. That would lead to a lot of investment in South Africa, but it also led to a close relationship between Al Gore and Mbeki. And so people I've talked to say that that relationship really mattered. So it mattered when Gore asked him directly to support this effort. There might have also been some coercion. I've seen in some reports that some claim that the US threatened South Africa's place on the nuclear suppliers group, said if you're not in favor of indefinite extension, then we question your credentials in non-proliferation. Just hard to imagine given that they actually gave up their nuclear weapons and are the only country to do so, but if you don't go along with indefinite extension. And so Mandela charged Mbeki ultimately with making this decision about which way to go. And they didn't make their decision until quite at sort of the last minute before the conference in New York. And so in the end, they agreed to support indefinite extension if it came with some non-binding principles. So part of the compromise package was these non-binding principles, many of which have not been fulfilled to this day, again, non-binding. And so by the time they get to this conference in the spring, a majority of states were on the record favoring indefinite extension, and they were able to extend the treaty in perpetuity. The non-aligned movement, within that movement, some had gone along with this position, some brought to the table their own proposals, but they were not unified. And so I want to just highlight in this case, the last observable implication is that this outcome should reflect embeddedness. And I said at the beginning that South Africa is considered moderately embedded. You usually wouldn't expect to see the kind of full court press that we saw here on South Africa, but I think it represents how important indefinite extension was to the US. I almost think it was overkill. I would love to hear, but I think there are those in South Africa now that wonder if something different could have been done, but there was a lot of pressure on the South African state to go along with this. All right, and then the last example is quick. In the book, I talk about not only is the US promoting universalization of each of these agreements and activities, it also leads adaptations. So something like helping to establish the nuclear suppliers group after India's so-called peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974. Another really important adaptation to the regime is the 1997 Model Additional Protocol. This was the new safeguards agreement that was developed after the Gulf War, when inspectors went into Iraq and realized that Iraq under Saddam Hussein had this secret nuclear weapons program in the 80s, despite being a member of the NPT, despite having a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA, and despite inspectors going in, I think pretty regularly, every 6 months, they were able to really hide the program from inspectors. And so the US and other members of the international community said we need something stronger, and this is what they developed. I go through the negotiations in the book. I think the US really got almost everything it wanted in terms of the stringent agreement. It mainly was negotiating with a group represented by Germany, which represented mostly developed nations that had nuclear reactors for energy, who are worried about how this would affect their nuclear industry. And so I just, as expected for a highly embedded state, Japan quickly concluded an AP. It was the first state with significant nuclear infrastructure to conclude this agreement. And since then, Japan, along with the US, but Japan has been one of the most significant diplomatic and financial supporters of the additional protocol. So It provides extra budgetary expenses to the IAEA. It also leads several conferences and workshops to bring other states in or to go to states and talk about the laws that they need to establish, the regulations they need to establish in order to be able to bring in or to conclude an additional protocol. I highlight this case here to show that the hegemon's allies, the US allies, use many of their own diplomatic and financial resources to promote elements of the regime. All right, so implications of this research. The first is that global order making goes beyond the initial creation of institutions. It's not enough for the powerful state to show up and help the institution become founded or established. Order making entails promoting global rules year after year and leading the way when adaptations to the rules are deemed necessary. And so we see in countless cables and meetings, US diplomats, sometimes the president, sometimes the vice president, have sought to persuade foreign leaders to join non-proliferation treaties and agreements. And so, for example, during the Carter administration, you see all these cables with him trying to persuade Sri Lanka to join the treaty, right? Spending the president's very valuable time working on that effort, sending similar to Indonesia. And in most of these agreements, the US pursues universal adherence, right? That was a choice. The US didn't have to make that choice. The US could have decided, we are just going to try to get on board the countries that we think are plausible proliferators, those that have this technology. But instead, the US has sought universal adherence, I think, to create this really worldwide norm against nuclear proliferation. A second implication is that the US continues to decline in relative terms. Again, I'm saying relative terms, so the economies of other states are rising, so the gap between others in the US shrinks. Then the US will lose some of its leverage that it's had previously. I mean, we're seeing this already. But the US was able to affect the cost-benefit calculation of all these other states because of the carrots and sticks it had to offer. And then I think as other countries are rising, we see that the US might not have the same ability to persuade states, right? Other states in the international system may be able to offer things without the strings attached that the US often puts into its agreements. But I would say that the way that I think the US could lose influence and its ability to shape order, global order, the most is by weakening its alliance commitments, right? Promoting and sustaining these global rules would have been much more difficult without US allies. And then a final implication of this research is that the nuclear non-proliferation regime will be affected by changes in the distribution of global power. And so we've seen that this regime has survived through US hegemony in both bipolar and unipolar systems. Not so sure about multipolarity. A period without a clear hegemon could endanger the regime, as you wouldn't have the strong state powerful enough to address regime weaknesses, encourage states to adhere, and to organize the international community when there's violations against the regime. And so I think it's particularly dangerous if we see the US losing influence and we don't see China taking on the role of regime underwriter soon enough. And I don't think we're seeing that now. A gap between hegemons who really care about this could be dangerous in terms of global proliferation. And I think even in a truly multipolar system, if we have that, it might be difficult for great powers to coordinate action within the regime, even if they all agree on some level of the value of non-proliferation. I do think, and maybe this is something for future research, but I think the question of whether the US is unique in this and that a future hegemon would see non-proliferation in the same way, I think is interesting. I theoretically, when I wrote this book or started, assumed if China becomes very powerful, it'll operate similarly to the US and see proliferation as a threat. And now I'm wondering if maybe not. So I think time will tell, and maybe the theory there was wrong. All right, I'll go through these really quickly because I know we want to have some discussion. The policy recommendations, and these were written a couple of years ago. They were written in the previous administration. So some things have become harder and some things have become easier since that time. So the first was to renew the US commitment to diplomacy and to the diplomatic corps. So when I was writing this conclusion, There was articles every day about the hollowing out of the State Department, all the retirements, people leaving, you're losing all of this tacit knowledge and experience in this area, but also in other areas. And so this book shows how important this sort of deep bench of diplomats is for persuading other countries to adhere to this regime and to US preferred rules. Now, the Biden administration has committed to rebuilding US diplomacy, but that's a generational task, right? That's not something that happens in 4 years or 8 years even. The next is strengthen and maintain alliance relationships. Again, the previous president maybe said things that made you wonder about how much the US was committed to NATO or other alliance member or other allies. Obviously, the war in Ukraine has bolstered cohesion amongst NATO in particular, but the evidence in this book illustrates over and over again the value of US allies in developing, promoting, and supporting non-proliferation goals. Third, the US should act with urgency in attempting to lock in existing elements of the regime with as many states as possible in the near term. There is power in the almost universal nature of the NPT, but there are other regime agreements that are not universal. And I'll focus here on the additional protocol. There are some significant holdouts: Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Belarus, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Egypt all do not have that strongest safeguards agreement that allows us to have less confidence about what they're doing with nuclear technology. There might need to be novel issue linkages here, different coalitions. I'm not saying specifically how this would happen, but I do think it's important for the regime, for its sustainability, that countries have concluded this model additional protocol. I would also appreciate it if the US would maybe ratify the CTBT, but that doesn't seem likely. As I said before, keep trying. China is really important to this effort. As China becomes more powerful, I would have assumed that it would have been a strong stakeholder in this regime, and I don't think we're seeing that right now. I know, talking to US officials, that this is an area of frustration, so it's not as if people don't know that it would be wonderful if we could be working with greater cooperation with China on non-proliferation. Sometimes I wonder if, because this has been such a strong US priority, if maybe China or Russia sometimes think they don't have to put the effort in because the US is sort of holding the line, so to speak. So again, I think it'll be interesting to see what that looks like in the future. My research shows that the promise of peaceful nuclear energy and peaceful nuclear technology has been an important tool in bringing countries into the NPT and then becoming more embedded with the broader regime. This was a factor in Japanese, Indonesian, and Egyptian decisions to join the NPT. I look at this issue in a separate paper called Supply to Deny. And so the continued global interest in nuclear energy as a way to have a cleaner energy mix could be helpful to this regime, except if the dominant suppliers don't require things like the additional protocol. And I would say we don't see China and Russia seeming to make, for example, the additional protocol a condition of supply. And then finding a way forward on nuclear disarmament. This is probably the hardest recommendation right now. Division over disarmament threatens the widespread support of the NPT, support that the US and allies and others have worked hard to achieve. We know that a majority of the world states are dissatisfied with disarmament progress to date. And out of this disappointment and frustration, we get the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the so-called ban treaty that entered into force in 2021, which bans all activities related to nuclear weapons, which none of the N5 or the P5 are a part of and did not participate in negotiating for. And so we see that pressure at the same time that we see folks maybe focus more on nuclear deterrence and what it can do because of Russia's war in Ukraine. Nonetheless, I think there has to be some moving forward on disarmament, talking about it, setting out a vision for it, and things that are really visible to other countries, because this is going to continue to be a sticking point within this regime. And I think it's going to be hard to find cooperation on other issues while this is so at front and center. And so that is the end, and I'm happy to talk more with you in the Q&A.
Great. Let me take a list of people in the room. We'll have questions first. And a tradition here is to have the fellows give the first question. So please, Naomi, and then I'll have you next. And pass it over here afterwards.
Great. Hi, I'm Naomi Eagle. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. Thanks so much, Rebecca. It's a great talk. I have a question for you about the embeddedness at the sort of core of the theory. And first, I'm wondering if you can clarify sort of the distinction between low cost and high cost diplomacy and sort of how it being high level makes it high cost in the absence of positive inducements or linkage, which seem to be a different level or variable. But I'm wondering, when you brought up the Cuba case, which was really interesting, you stated that Cuba has largely acted in accordance even before joining. And so I'm wondering, if a state is embedded, why would it act in accordance but not join? And if a state is not embedded or less embedded, why would it still act in accordance with the regime but not if it's not embedded? And so if you could sort of clarify how this joining versus acting in accordance, how embeddedness matters for that.
Great. Should I answer or should we collect?
Oh, no,
or-
answer.
Thank you, Naomi. So, I mean, with the Cuban case, what I see is that the treaty is representative of US leadership. So it is a way for them to reject US leadership without taking an action that they probably didn't want to take anyway. I mean, I don't think they wanted to raise concerns that they were proliferating. And I think it's almost, it is sort of a way to say, like, to reject the US and reject the US led order, to say, we're doing this, but we're not doing it in your way. And then in the reverse, you said if a country is embedded and doesn't join, right? I mean, I think Israel is probably the example, and usually that's the first question I get. So, and I point out there that, 3 different administrations did try to do something about the Israeli program. So we know Kennedy even threatened relations with Israel over the nuclear activities there. He insisted on safeguards, or tried to insist on safeguards, for the Dimona reactor. He sent US inspectors in, who came back and said, everything's fine here, it's just peaceful. And then we have Johnson, and then Nixon at one point thinks about using inducements. He thinks about, I think it's the Phantom 4 aircraft. Yeah, just to say, maybe we should say, if you join the NPT, we'll give you these. But then they thought that would actually bring more attention than if the deal didn't go through to the nuclear program. And so, I mean, the Israeli case is a tough one, but you would think of that as a country that's more embedded within the US regime. I do think the fact that the agreement that we came to with Israel in 1969 to not overtly talk about it was a non-proliferation effort, right? To not kind of have other countries in the region feel like they needed to respond, I think was helpful. And then the high cost, low cost question, I mean, to me, with the president and vice president's time being so valuable, if they're willing in a meeting to focus on this issue, that is costly because it's time they're not spending somewhere else. So someone who's sitting at the State Department at their desk working on this issue every day, that's what they're supposed to be doing. But I think of it as high cost when you do have those top government officials involved, just because of the valuable nature of their time, and that, it's an opportunity cost, essentially. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Gaspar.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for now it's working. Thank you for your presentation and the different tools that you've put on our disposal. This will help us. But I had while or when you were displaying or showing us everything, something came into my mind that I just want some more help and clarification. We see that Nelson Mandela's administration, I mean the South African administration, standing by their own, willingly to put aside nuclear weapons, to dismantle and so forth. But it means that they had that need toward non-proliferation. They were supporting non-proliferation regime. But why, when it came to indefinitely to bring the NPT to an indefinite
Mhm.
um, way. Why is it the U.S. administration, the Clinton administration, had to convince them to stand like having a deal so that they can get them involved? Because we know at that time South Africa, mostly Nelson Mandela was a key personality in Africa. Bringing him would also bring others within the region to join.
Mhm.
But why was it like to have a deal with Nelson Mandela of
Why
South
was it
Africa?
hard to get?
Why? Because they were already
Yes.
willing for non-proliferation. Why? What was the issue?
Yes. So this gets back to the issue of non-proliferation and disarmament. So many people in the non-aligned movement, or many countries in the non-aligned movement, Indonesia was one of the leaders, wanted to have rolling extensions or distinct periods because this was I should have said this was a key period of leverage that countries might have had over the nuclear weapon states because they have a majority, they have the numbers, right? So if the non-aligned movement could say, we'll only go along with this if you really take disarmament seriously or you take another action. So it was like that was the one time. And then by indefinitely extending the treaty, you don't have that time again. So I think that was a hard position for the South Africans to be in because, yes, they do support non-proliferation and the regime, but they also gave up a really strong point of leverage. And to me, I mean, there's people who disagree with me about the South African case. There's people who say they weren't pressured by the U.S. Of course, no country wants to say they were pressured by another country to do anything. So you're not going to like find a lot of evidence of that. But I think it's really hard in the context of the transition to democracy and all of the aid that the US was promising. It's really hard for me to imagine Mbeki having Al Gore, Bill Clinton say, please do this. This is really important to us. By the way, you know, we're giving you like so much money to help you to just to ignore that. So I think it's hard not to see that conversation or that decision in that context.
David Holloway.
Yeah, David Holloway here at CSAC. Yeah, thanks very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you about two cases you didn't mention.
Yeah.
So one of our former colleagues, Sig Hecker, has just published a book on the North Korean nuclear program in which he says the US mishandled it very badly and didn't use diplomacy to try to reach some kind of agreement with North Korea. And the second case I want to mention is Pakistan, where there was a lot of aid being given to Pakistan.
Mhm.
A kind of blind eye was turned to
Yes.
what Pakistan was doing. So the question then is, right, you have the hegemon, and the hegemon has a toolkit, but how well does the hegemon use it?
Mm.
And secondly, what are the anti-hegemon's tool resources? After all, it's a relationship, right? And those who want to resist the hegemony have ways of doing it.
Mhm.
And of course, lots of people don't want to. They don't want to see a world with nuclear weapons. So they're quite happy with the regime, not necessarily because they follow US leadership, but because they don't want other states around them to have nuclear weapons. So that leads to the question whether setting it up as saying Kennedy predicted we would have 15 or 20 nuclear weapon states in 1975 is actually a real target against you can measure anything,
Right.
given that it's his speculation about how things might go rather than an actual outcome.
Yes, that is an excellent point. I mean, I think it's possible that as scholars of proliferation, we have overestimated the desire that countries felt for nuclear weapons. Maybe absent the NPT, there wouldn't be that many more. I do think that the NPT did solve the security dilemma, and particularly now that we have the additional protocol, that does breed a level of confidence that allows states to kind of feel comfortable not developing nuclear weapons. I mean, again, we can't rerun the history here, but I do think the strong normative commitment and the ability for countries to commit legally to do something they weren't going to do anyway, it has been helpful. In terms of the cases that you asked about, I would agree. I haven't read that yet, but from my knowledge of the North Korean case, it seems like things could have gone better. I mean, Chris Hill, I remember going to a talk with him at one point and feeling like they were actually getting getting some sort of diplomatic breakthrough before Kim Jong-il passed away or got sick. The additional protocol, I'm sorry, the agreed framework. I think there's arguments on both sides that neither side completely did their part in living up to the agreement. We do see that North Korea was pressured to join the NPT by the Soviet Union. So that is one case where the Soviet Union pressured a country to join. Sometimes I wonder if a country was pressured so much to join, if that was most of the calculation, how strong is that commitment? And the US pressured Saudi Arabia to join right after they got these missiles from China and we got worried. And so it's like when you're really under strong superpower pressure to do something and not necessarily because you came to decide this was in the best interest of you and your neighbors and international security, what does that mean for your long-term commitment? So North Korea is a very difficult case. I mean, one thing that when I talked about this division that we have today in the NPT community, it's going to make it difficult to make changes that need to be, or adaptations that need to be taken. And one of the biggest ones is the US, I think for about 15 years, has tried to do something about the withdrawal clause of the NPT, somehow make it so countries can't do what North Korea did, which is collect all this peaceful nuclear technology that then it's going to withdraw from the treaty and use to build a bomb. And it's been hard for the US to do that. And I would think now it's almost impossible to get countries to want to be on board with cooperating with the US to do something to strengthen that part of the regime. You're absolutely right on Pakistan. We turned a blind eye. I talk in the book, I didn't go through it here, but other observable implications of this theory are that when the US doesn't promote non-proliferation as a priority, the regime weakens. And so we have the examples, Pakistan is probably the biggest example, when Reagan kept signing on that said, nope, they don't have nuclear weapons. And so there were times during the Cold War that I would say the US did subjugate non-proliferation, which is usually a top goal, to the strategic contest with the Soviet Union. Another example is Indonesia wanted to develop a nuclear weapons free zone in the 80s, and we had supported other we'd supported the Latin American nuclear weapons free zone because we thought that was in our interest. But we have Secretary Schultz going to Jakarta and saying, please don't do this. We don't want this nuclear weapons free zone because they were worried about transit of surface ships and submarines. So I think it's not a perfect record. And then Nixon is a whole other story, which is not a great record either. But by and large, the US and particularly the State Department and ACTA levels have been very committed. And it's not that other states aren't committed, but I think the relative interests of the US is greater than other states. I'm not trying to argue other states don't have agency in this determination, but the US tries to kind of press on the lever and affect their cost benefit calculations about joining an agreement. It's a lot.
Julie and then Rod, then I'm going to turn to people online and come back to the audience if there's time remaining. Julie.
Hi, my name is Julie George. I'm a predoctoral fellow here at CSAC and at the Institute for Human-Centered AI. Thanks so much for your great presentation, Rebecca. I really enjoyed listening about the tools of influence with low cost and high cost positive inducements. My question is, to what extent is the role of allies and partners in the Hegemon's toolkit? I know you brought this up in the policy recommendations, but I'd like to hear more about, how does the US use allies and partners to advance its goals of the non-proliferation regime, and how relevant are they? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think the role of allies are really important. They're usually the first countries to join the agreements, and then they turn around and then promote it to the countries where they have interest. So there's certain countries where, the UK or France is going to have more influence over a particular country than the US. In interviewing US allies, I had one person say, this was during the Obama administration, they said, when we get any requests from the US, it automatically gets a +1 because we support US leadership and the US-led order. Maybe they wouldn't say that today, I don't know. But the sense that we have interests with the US that are aligned when we're thinking about global rules and norms. And so when they ask us to do something, not that every country is just going to go along with it, but they'll assess it and maybe give it greater priority in their own governments. Yeah, does that help answer your question?
Rod.
I'm Rod Ewing. I'm a co-director here at CSAC. So I was very interested in your recommendation number 5, that is to bolster U.S. the U.S. nuclear industry. And I'm surprised because it's not just bolstering an industry, it comes as a package of activities from the front end to the back end of the fuel cycle. And those activities potentially include reprocessing. If you look at discussions of advanced reactors and advanced fuel cycles, the goal, very generally speaking, is to have reprocessing as part of the fuel cycle. There's the issue of expense. It's very, expensive technology to use to leverage some other activity. That expense has an impact on other energy sources that might be displaced in the process, solar, wind, whatever. So have you thought about the bigger picture of what it means to bolster the nuclear industry, and what does that picture look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think this is a very difficult lift at this point with the state of the U.S. nuclear industry. What I'm saying is that I'm worried that when countries go to Russia or China, lots of Russian industry has been affected by the war, but the last article I read said Rosatom has not been affected. They're still planning to build the reactors for different countries where they're building them. And so to me, it's a concern. Belarus has reactors that built by Russia, and they don't have an additional protocol. So I know that there's a lot more that goes into that recommendation. And our regulatory environment makes it hard for me to imagine a business person saying, if given a choice, that I would want a nuclear reactor over solar or wind or hydro. But if the US is out of the game of providing the technology at all, then I think it's harder to promote non-proliferation to the same countries who are now going to have these technologies that could be dangerous. I mean, I would still say I prefer we don't sell ENR to anybody, and that we keep that standard. But it's like, would you rather have Russia supplying it or us? And I would rather have the US supplying it. But I agree, it's a very, very complicated issue. And I almost left that one out of the book because I am not an expert in the nuclear industry. Just my sense is that the US has more provisions about non-proliferation attached to its supply than other countries that we may consider adversaries. But it's
We have a distinguished audience on Zoom watching including your family, but former officials, scholars from around the world. I wanted to combine both a question from Paul Edwards, our colleague here at Stanford, and Dave Elliott, who was a physicist working on the NSC under the Nixon administration, having roles in some of these. It's asking you a forward-looking question. Given what's happened in Ukraine, the Russian aggression, Bill Clinton saying he regrets now putting pressure on Ukraine to get rid of the weapons, Russian weapons on its soil, the Soviet weapons on its soil. What influence will that have on non-nuclear weapon states moving forward, keeping their NPT commitments versus trying to sneak out or withdraw or hedge with nuclear programs themselves?
Yeah, that's the big question right now, right? Is what does this mean for non-proliferation? Well, countries take the simple lesson, I think it's too simplistic, and say, oh, if Ukraine had just kept those weapons that it had on its soil from the Soviet Union, then this wouldn't be happening. I mean, there's all the issues about them not having command and control. The US put a ton of pressure on them, so it's hard to imagine them becoming kind of members of the international community in the way that they did had they kept them on their soil. I think my friend Mariana Bujarin, who has a book on this, is the expert here, but she talks about how the Bucharest Memorandum wasn't kind of actively used. It was kind of set aside. So maybe diplomatically, there were more ways with the UK and the US and Russia over time to bolster that agreement in some way. In terms of what it means for proliferation, I do think initially the proliferation concern has been overstated, and that we still have this regime. We still have countries that get punished for proliferating. I think the fact remains that most states, to go back to David Holloway's point, don't actually want nuclear weapons at this point. People, like most countries, don't aspire to be Iran or North Korea in the international system today. In the long term, though, I think it is a concern, but it will really matter what happens in this war, right? The outcome of this war is so important in terms of what the lessons that countries take from it. If Russia is able to be perceived as a winner, I mean, there's also the issue: will countries want these weapons to do what Russia did? And that's something that Secretary of Defense Austin said. You know, countries want this will get this hunting license, I think is what he said, which I think is unfortunate use of words, but again, it's going to depend on what happens in the war. If nuclear weapons were used, you know, how are they used, in what context, what kind of, I mean, this gets into some of your work, right? Like what is the damage that is done? What is it seen as a civilian target? Are many civilians killed? And we actually see the terrible destructive nature that the world hasn't really seen since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that does that actually, you know, reform the taboo or strengthen that taboo? Or does it look like, oh, they hit a military target with a small nuclear weapon and that helped them win, and doesn't seem to be a big deal? I would hope that wouldn't happen, but that's a very different lesson that's going to be learned than if a lot of civilians are killed and we see the aftermath for months of what happens after a nuclear explosion in a populated area. So
I think your piece with
here,
Keir Lieber is really valuable on this, saying that people talk about the effects of nuclear weapons use or nuclear threats, and it depends on whether they're successful or not. And the context really matters here, as does the context here. I have one last question. Let me ask the last question. If I could. You talked in the excellent analysis of the final agreement to have permanent extension, indefinite extension, about the U.S. bringing other people on board. If I understand the treaty correctly, there is no need for the NPT review conference to have a consensus about something. There's need just to have a vote on it. And a reason why the United States would get new countries to join, including the Vatican to join, isn't because they're concerned about the Vatican getting nuclear weapons, is they want the Vatican's vote. Right. Was there ever a thought about, let's just bring this to a vote and get the numbers, versus trying to create a consensus which tries to create a spirit of the NPT being a universalist statement? How did the politics of that work out?
So I think the US government did think there was going to be a vote, and Canada collected a list of people who's on our side, who's against. Leading up to this conference, the Secretary of State would have 2 meetings a week where they would talk to people all over the world from, you know, the diplomatic corps and say, how are we? Have you asked this person? Where are we on our list? Part of that effort was also bringing more states in. So I don't know the exact number, but a not small number of states did join the NPT in the lead up of this because of their votes, particularly countries where the US thought that they would have influence.
Yes, Sir Tom Graham went all over the world for years trying to do this.
Yes, and with Susan Burke. And I talked to them both at length about their efforts there. I mean, one of the first things the US did just to get the numbers was move the conference from, I believe it was supposed to be in Geneva. Traditionally, these RevCons have been in Geneva, and they moved it to New York to be at the UN headquarters to make sure that more states would have representatives, because you can't vote if you're not there, right? And so there was a lot of thinking about the numbers. I think, but most people who were there in the US government tell me by the time they showed up, they knew they had the numbers. I think they thought it looked bad to go to a vote and showed the divisiveness. There was a debate over a secret ballot or not, because the non-aligned movement, a lot of countries wanted a secret ballot so countries wouldn't be pressured by the US, right? Their vote didn't have to be a public announcement. And in the end, I think it's Dana Paula, who was the leader of that conference. I think he was clever, and that he said, consensus exists that there's a majority, and then he banged his gavel. So that is an interesting turn of phrase, right? Consensus exists that there's a majority. So there wasn't actually consensus, but they let it go at that.
Pounding a gavel is sometimes very effective if you want to answer the. But we must pound the gavel now because it's 2 o'clock. And just please join me in thanking Rebecca for this Really, really interesting talk.
Thank you.